Well, hello everyone. Nothing like Lex to get a bit of emotion happening around the place. I think my sermon will be nice and boring compared to that, which will give you a chance to catch your breath before we have a time of prayer after the last song. So it's really good to be here, and it's I feel quite privileged following on from Kath's message, my wife who preached last week. So Lex, being unwell, has managed to drag a few of the oldies out. So Lex has been preaching on relationships, so what I wanted to do is just continue on that. And tonight we're going to look at parent-child relationships and the power of example. There's so many different types of relationships that we have in our lives, but one of the most common, and yet so often the most difficult, is parent-child relationships. I'm sure we all are involved in some form of parent-child relationship. It can be the most difficult because it can be the most painful when things are fractured, when things aren't going how we want them to go. Now, I'd love to say that I've had it all together and that I've done everything really, really well. And yet even when we try really hard to do our best, we still make mistakes, and there's things that I wish that I had done differently. I remember a time I gave my word to my kids, and then I ended up going back on my word and doing the opposite to what I said. And that's over 20 years ago, and you remember it when you make mistakes like that. The fact that I can remember it so far on shows that it was significant to me, and I believe it would have had some significance to my kids as well. So I thought I'd have a look in the Bible at some of the things that the Bible says on parenting and on children, and it actually says quite a lot about children obeying and honouring your parents, and we've got some verses that will be coming up in a sec that I'll read through. It tells us about fathers being taught not to provoke their children to anger, verses on training a child on the way they should go and they will not leave it. So we'll just have a look at those. So Exodus 20:12, honour your father and mother, then you will live a long, full life in the land the Lord God is giving you. Then Proverbs 1:8, my child, listen when your father corrects you. Don't neglect your mother's instruction. And Ephesians 6:4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger by the way you treat them. Rather, bring them up with the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord. And Proverbs 22:6, direct your children onto the right path, and when they are older, they will not leave it. So there are a few verses in the Bible that specifically talk about that parent-child relationship. And I tried to think of some examples of some really good parent-child relationships from the Bible that we can learn from. But so many that came to mind are actually quite famous characters, and they might have been used mightily by God, but they were actually lousy parents. And I've lost where I am. Broken relationships, particularly between sons and their fathers, were very, very commonplace in many of the Bible stories. There are lots of examples that we can learn of how not to be a parent. There are examples of men like King David that had a terrible relationship with his son Absalom, to the point that Absalom wanted to kill David and take his kingdom, take his throne. Another of his sons, David's sons, tried the same thing many, many years later. Then you had David's other son, Amnon, who raped his half-sister, and then David did nothing about it. That ended up causing things to escalate even further. And so, which was Absalom taking things into his own hands and getting Amnon killed. Did David love Absalom? Yes. Absolutely he did, and when you read further on, you'll see the grief that David went through when Absalom was killed. But it shows that loving your child doesn't guarantee good parenting and it also doesn't guarantee a good relationship with your kids. And yet love is a massively important ingredient that we can't do without, but it's more, we need more than that. The story of David also shows us how God can use us, just like he did David, even with our flaws, and David with his flaws. And yet David, in his situation, he still reaped the consequences of that, those relationship breakdowns he had with his kids, and what I would say was poor parenting. So rather tonight than give you a whole lot of points on how we can have better relationships with our kids, I just wanted to focus on one key point, which is leading by example, or the power of example. I think it's just so underestimated in our lives. So just to share a little funny story, or not so funny story, we have 2 sheep at our place. They're uncatchable. Unless you had a couple of really good dogs, they're basically, these sheep are uncatchable. And so I just hope I never need to drench them. We drenched them when we bought them, and that'll have to last a while, I think. A few months ago, they'd eaten out all the feed in the paddock they were in, and I needed to shift them into another paddock, which only had a little small gate into it. And I couldn't just open the gate and leave the sheep to work it out and go in themselves, because that paddock had chooks in that had to stay there and they couldn't go anywhere else. So I had to get these sheep somehow to go through this little gate. So that sounds nice and easy, doesn't it? Well, not wanting to be outsmarted by a couple of dumb sheep, I created a little fence that came off that gate, making a little wing, and then I got my helpers, my little helpers, being my 3 grandchildren, you know, and we nice and quietly started to round those 2 sheep up towards that gate, and everything was going really smoothly to start with, and we would put that little bit of pressure on, and they initially responded and obligingly headed in the right direction. So I thought, this is going good. But once the pressure really started to build, all of a sudden they erupted and galloped flat out in the wrong direction. Well, I'm not easily beaten. So back to it again with my little 3 helpers. And it was looking really good until the sheep erupted again and ran straight towards one of our twin granddaughters, nearly knocking her over and giving her a really, really big fright. In fact, our 2 twins used to be very scared of dogs. Now we can add sheep to the mix. Now, don't tell their mum. That's our secret, okay? So not wanting to risk injury to my grandkids, I gave up until the next day. So this time my approach was totally different. I pinched some of Kath's delicious horse feed. At least the sheep thought it was delicious. I haven't tried it. And I put a small container full halfway down the paddock. So the sheep soon found it and gobbled it up. So the next day, I gave them another cupful in the container, only this time I moved it up halfway to the gate. And on the 3rd day, sounds like a resurrection, I put the container just through the gate with some more feed in it, and I stepped back into the paddock that I wanted them to come into. And believe it or not, they came up, they ate the feed nicely, they started eating the grass all around them and happily stayed in the paddock. And there was no adrenaline, not from me or the sheep. And it actually worked. And to me, this showed how trying to lead those sheep by pushing them was never going to work. Not without good dogs, but just me and my grandchildren, it didn't work. But as soon as I led from in front of them and gave them a reason to follow me, the results were wonderful. And I believe that's how it can work with parenting. Whether you like it or not, your kids will follow you. They will follow your examples, they'll follow the good ones, and they'll most certainly follow the bad ones. Me trying to pressure those sheep into responding how I wanted was, I guess, just like a parent provoking their child to anger, pushing for change rather than leading by example. The closer the relationship you can have with your kids, the greater the chance of them following what you do. And I say following what you do because that is the main event. Yes, what we say is important, but nowhere near as important as what we do. Now, for anyone that's studied the 5 love languages, you'll be familiar with one of them being called words of affirmation. Well, with me, words of affirmation is definitely not my main love language. So Kath can tell me all these wonderful things about me, as you do, Kath. She can tell me, because that's Kath's love language. She's trying to give me a hint, you see. So she can tell me how much she loves me, how proud she is of me, how blessed she is to be married to me. However, it's when she helps me, especially when she doesn't feel like it, that's when I really know that she loves me. And I wonder, is it possible that our relationships with our kids are very similar? We can tell them how much we love them all day long, but if our actions don't show them that they are valuable, that they are a high priority, then our words can be meaningless. Now, I was reminded of this a few days ago. So as a few of you would know, I have a close relationship with my brother Lex. In fact, yes, I even love him. And that's even when I know his weaknesses and I know his strengths as well. And I probably know both his weaknesses and strengths more than a lot of people that are here. And at the moment, as we've been aware tonight, if you hadn't been already, Lex has been going through a really, really tough last 12 days or so. A really tough time. He's been very, very sick. Now, I could say to Lex, Lex, is there anything I can do? Anything? What can I do to help? Is there anything I could do? But to say all that means nothing if my actions don't match up. Now just imagine, if he asked me to preach for him tonight. That's a really big one. Do I really care about doing anything I can to help him? Do I really love him and want to serve him and see what I can do? Or is it all just talk? Now, for the record, I wasn't actually asked that question. Because we know each other quite well, he didn't need to ask. I knew that there was a need there. I was able to help, and so I offered. Now, was it easy for me to offer? Definitely no. I actually try my hardest to avoid preaching, if at all possible. But I knew that God wanted me to preach tonight and that it was a way I could do my small part to help out in serving in our church family. The power of example we have as parents, it can never be underestimated. If we want our kids to use bad language, then all we have to do is use some bad language. If we want them to drink alcohol, then there's one sure way of teaching them that. If we want them to cheat on their taxes, or it comes under the next one, treat their future spouse poorly or react with anger when the pressure is on, there are some guaranteed ways we can teach them that. But on the flip side, when we live our lives the way Jesus wants us to and example that in our lives, we are leading by an example that is likely to give positive results. And I say likely because God has made us all with a free will. And the bottom line is that we cannot force anything on our kids once they're adults. They will do whatever they want to do, regardless of what we think. Our responsibility is to do everything we can to give them every opportunity to make good choices. I remember as a kid, my parents used to send us off every school holidays to these Christian ESA camps. Anyone that's got a few years under them would remember these ESA camps. Both locally around here and also down at Phillip Island was one of my favourite places. Now, my parents' motive wasn't to have a break from parenting. Well, maybe not completely. It was to give us every opportunity for us to develop our own relationship with Jesus. Sure, we did some fun things on those camps and maybe a few things we shouldn't have, but I do remember favourably how those camps did help my personal relationship with Jesus grow. They were very special times. My parents had chosen to give other Christian leaders the opportunity to have an influence in our lives, even as children. They positioned us so that we had every opportunity to follow Jesus. In fact, they spent their whole lives giving us every reason to follow Jesus. For me, it was like it was never a big decision because it would have been really, really difficult to actually try and believe that God didn't exist in my family. Now, when our kids were at home, or when they were all at home, we chose to go up to Hillsong every year, often when we could hardly afford it. It was one way we could give them every opportunity to grow in their relationship with Jesus. And in doing that, we actually showed them an example for us of how important it was for us to both worship God and also grow in faith in our walk with God. And then on the long trips we'd have back from Sydney, we'd all get a chance to share what we'd been learning that week. Now, do all our kids follow Jesus? No, unfortunately they don't. But we have done our part and they know the way home. Now, 3 of our kids are serving God as either pastors or married to a pastor. And I'm not saying that to show off. I'm saying that because I'm actually thrilled that they've chosen to love the church even when the church has let them down. If our examples as parents has somehow influenced that, because we've also been hurt at times from the church, then I'm very, very pleased. Now, all 3 of them have been involved in ministry for a very long time and have seen some of the ugly side of church leadership, where character weaknesses can destroy relationships, respect, and people's lives. They've chosen not to give up on God's bride, but to be a part in helping it to be a healthy bride. Now, for those watching online, I know some of you may have lost hope in church because of letdowns, being treated poorly, but I encourage you that it is still God's answer for this world. It is his only plan. God wants us to be in a regular relationship with other Christians so we can help each other and build each other up. If somehow God can use us here at Redgum to be an encouragement for you, then that's awesome. That's our privilege. I know we're encouraged as we hear snippets back of what God is doing in your lives. In fact, at board level, we can't stop Lex telling us how encouraged he is by emails, texts, messages and phone calls from people that are watching online. So thank you for that. And keep them coming, because it is encouraging for us as well when we see that some of the work that we're doing here is actually ministering to people outside of these walls as well. Now, Kath and I both enjoy a little bit of deer hunting. So a few months ago, Kath and I were up the mountains hunting, and I dropped Kath off in her spot and I went up to my spot at the top of the mountain. Now, I'm usually in my old troopy and I always know exactly where I put my car keys on my troopy. In fact, anyone that goes with me, they know they can always find my car keys in this spot. But on this occasion, we actually had our fancy 200 series Land Cruiser, and it has remote locking. And I thought, where am I going to put these keys? And I didn't even realise at the time that if you use the remote to lock it rather than just pressing the button, that you can actually leave one set of keys in the car, and you can also hide the keys under the car, because I thought, well, I can't hide the keys because if it's within a metre, then anyone walks near it, they can just open it. So you learn all this stuff as you go along. Anyhow, what I did is I got the keys, and there'll be a picture of them up there in a minute, and I clipped Kath's keys and my keys together, and I think we've actually grown. We've got a few extras here, and we've got rid of a few. So we clipped them together, and I thought, okay, well, what am I going to do with these? Where am I going to hide these? And I'll just find my place. So it had the two remotes for our 200 series were both on there because of clipping them both together. We also had a remote for the Hyundai that we had. And it also had a bit of wool, some purple wool, where Kath had braided a bit of thing for some reason, I don't know, but it did serve a purpose, as you'll find out. So I thought, well, I'm not going to lug these keys all around the bush while I'm hunting, so I thought, okay, I'll just walk up the track a bit, and there was a tree to use as a landmark, and so I carefully placed the keys in the long grass on the opposite side of the track to the tree, because the tree was sort of up a cliff. And I thought, with that bit of purple wool on there, that'll make it really easy for me to see them later when I come back in torchlight to find my keys. And I thought, that'll work great. So after an uneventful hunt, I returned after dark and went straight to where I thought I'd left the keys, and they weren't there. So I was a bit horrified. I've never had that happen. And I thought, well, they must have just fallen down through the long grass, because I sort of just had them halfway down. I thought they must have fallen all the way down. And they must be lower down in the grass. So what do? Obviously, I began plucking grass with my bare hands. So I plucked out the clumps of grass. And as I plucked them out, I'd throw them on the track behind me. And when I couldn't find the keys, I went wider, thinking, well, I must have been on an angle to the tree. Like, I thought I was square, but I thought maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I was a metre out. Maybe I was 2 metres out. Anyway, so I went wider, and when I still couldn't find them, I thought, well, I must have to go further into the bush. But I found that I could only go in about 1 metre, and then it was a big steep drop-off, so that sort of limited that. So I was limited to this metre this way and the length of the track this way. And by this time, Kath had rung and said she was freezing cold and waiting for a pickup. But being the bush girl she is, she soon got a fire going. Mind you, I don't even carry matches, but she was very prepared, so she lit a fire, and so then I knew that Kath wasn't going to die. And so I continued on my mission of finding these keys so we could go home that night. So after a while, I had a strip of bare dirt 1 metre across and 5 metres wide. As I said, maybe I was 2.5 metres out of alignment. You do what you got to do when you're desperate. So by the time I'd finished, that was my bare bit. Behind me in the middle of the track was a 1/2 metre high row of plucked grass 5 metres long. So by this time, things are really not looking too good. So I rang a friend who lived nearby, and he agreed to come and pick us up because we obviously weren't going home that night. Now, my logic had told me that in my enthusiasm to rip up, or desperateness, to rip up all the grass, that I must have somehow pulled a clump out with the keys and thrown them on the track. I mean, really? But as I said, somehow you've got to come up with an answer. So then I ended up deciding to go through every bit of grass on the track that I'd thrown there, check it all, make sure it definitely didn't have keys in, and then threw it over the cliff so I could never inspect it again over the steep drop-off. So at the end of this, my friend arrived and I explained the process I'd just gone through over the last hour and a half.
It was pitch black.
In the dark, yeah. I mean, I had a head torch, but... So again, my logic told me, don't trust your logic. Again, my logic told me that in throwing the clumps onto the track that may have had the keys in the clump, that the keys must have fallen out and be somewhere in the 5 metre long and 2 metre wide strip of knee-high grass on the track, a job for tomorrow. And he said to me, "Are you sure you're looking opposite the right tree?" I know what you're thinking. It's okay, I am a bushie and I know it was the right tree. However, to humour him, I walked about 15 metres further down the track to where the next tree was. So I got to the tree, and when I got there, I decided this is stupid, as I know it wasn't that tree. I knew which tree it was opposite. And so I turned around to give up, and there in the grass, about 13 metres away from where I'd spent an hour and a half looking, were my keys on the opposite side of the track to where I had left them. Now, anyone like to guess how they got there, apart from Lex? A crow? That's a very good guess. I didn't actually witness because I was off hunting, but I think the most likely thing would be either a bowerbird or a lyrebird. And they would have seen the bright purple and decided, I would like that to make a nice decoration for my nest, which they're famous for doing. And they'd obviously tried to carry it away, but not got very far because of how heavy it was. And amazingly, miraculously, that they had dropped it somewhere where I could actually find it, because the grass was this high everywhere. But they had taken it 13 metres and, yeah. So I know that's a really long story and fortunately has a very happy ending. But the truth is that we can be looking in the wrong place for the right answer. And no matter how hard we look, if the answer is not there, we actually can't find it. No matter how hard I looked opposite that tree, my keys weren't there. It didn't matter how logical I was or how much I ripped into those grass, I was never ever going to find my keys. And as parents, we tend to parent maybe how we were parented, but that doesn't mean that that's the best answer. Maybe we read a secular book on parenting, but who says that that's the best answer? Maybe we listen to our peers or the latest theories on how to raise children, or Facebook, that's a good idea. Maybe we've been told we need to treat them as equals and not let them and not us be the boss. Maybe we need to let them make all their own decisions, regardless how old they are. Maybe we've never even thought about it, but just did or are doing whatever we feel like. Well, I believe the Bible does have the answer, the right answer, and it's clear. It's clear that we are to be leaders, but we're to lead by example. And Jesus demonstrates that for us in John chapter 13, verses 12 to 15. So after washing their feet, he put on his robe again and sat down and asked, "Do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, because that's what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you." So Jesus demonstrates the washing of his disciples' feet, which is a humble example of serving, and then he commands them to do the same. Now, this example, I believe, was not just an example to each other as Christians, but also as church leadership and also as parents. We are the leaders of our families. What can we do to example to our kids this same attitude that Jesus has? When we lead as parents, we set things in motion. How we lead influences our kids, and it influences generations to come. My first wife, is not alive today to see what her kids are doing in serving Jesus with the gifts that they have. However, her parenting and love for Jesus and the church have been very significant in influencing our kids in the choices they have made. She has contributed to something being set in motion that is bigger than just herself. That is the responsibility of us all as parents. What are we setting in motion? What examples are we giving to our kids to follow? Now, a few weeks ago, Lex was talking about marriage relationships and stated that he's never worked on his marriage in his whole life. Now, before you take it out of context, he did go on to say that when he has allowed God to work on him, his marriage improves. And I think it's a bit like that as parents. Yes, it's good to have tools to help us and learn principles that can help our parenting, but the biggest key is that as we grow in our relationship with Christ, our parenting will improve, and so will our relationship with our kids. When we are thinking more like Christ wants us to, then our actions improve and our example improves. Now, Jesus says to come follow me. He is asking us to follow his example. There is a well-used Christian slogan which is, what would Jesus do? Now, as corny as it sounds, we actually need to be able to answer that question and follow his example. And as parents, I'm sure we have plenty of opportunities to ask ourselves that question many times a day. So what do we do if we've had terrible examples of parenting from our own parents? Maybe we've already messed up with relationships with our kids and can't change anything as it's all in the past. True, we can't change what has happened before, but we can change what is ahead. As mentioned earlier, our kids were created with free wills and we can't force any change on them as adult children, or as adults now. Jesus still has an answer on how we can move forward. He still has an our part he wants to lead us in and to help us with. You might think, well, what would God know about children that have turned their back on him and gone their own way? Well, that's exactly what happened in the Garden of Eden, and man has certainly been doing that ever since. I think he does know, and he has an answer for what our part is. We can't dictate their response, but we can be an example of a Jesus response if we know what it is. Jesus says if we want wisdom to ask him for it, and as parents, we need wisdom all the time. I'm reminded when Kath and I first got married, which was 22 years ago, we had 7 mostly teenagers to raise in our first year of marriage. The ones that weren't teenagers, I'm sure, thought they were teenagers. We felt like we had to be Solomon and constantly have wise solutions to difficult issues. Did we get it right all the time? No. But I believe our kids know that we did our best and that we love them, and we do have good relationships with our kids. The fact is, we are still setting examples of how we live today. Notice that I didn't say we are trying to set examples. The fact is we are all setting examples. The question is whether they're healthy examples or not. Our adult kids, they're still watching us. They're watching and observing how we live our lives for this stage we're in life. They're observing what is important to us, what are our values, how important to us are they as our adult children, how important are our grandchildren to us, all 22 of them. Yes, that's hard to believe, but it's true. Now, I remember when my first wife died, my mother-in-law pointed out to me how my kids were watching my every single move, watching to see if I was okay, watching my responses. Them seeing my trust in God and that everything was okay, even in my grief, gave them an example that they could follow as well. And I know that my responses hugely affected their responses at that very difficult time in their life. Now, even though I've shared a few funny stories today, if that's all you've heard, then I haven't done my bit. I want us all to look afresh at the examples we are setting and consider who is following our example. Jesus is saying, come follow me. As we follow him more and more, the effect of that can go on for generations to come. It's not all about just me. If we've been looking in the wrong places for the right answers, then we need to change where we are looking. The Bible is full of answers for us to follow. If we have fractured relationships with any of our kids, ask God to show you what Jesus would do. Let's all follow Jesus' example of servant leadership, both with our kids and with the people around us. Let's never forget the incredible, incredible power of example. Thank you.